So we are beginning our series of All Relationships Can Heal with healing your relationship with yourself. And today we're going to be talking about trauma, triggers, validation, and vulnerability. And we are really lucky to have with us today Dr. Robert T. Muller. He is the author of the book Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up, From Avoidance to Recovery and Growth. Because where there's been a trauma or something that was completely overwhelming to us, healing is critically important to help us come back into wholeness. So Robert T. Muller, PhD, trained at Harvard, was on faculty at the University of Massachusetts, and is currently at York University in Toronto. Dr. Muller is a fellow of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, or ISSTD, for his work on trauma treatment. His new book is Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up, and his bestseller, Trauma and the Avoidant Client, has been translated widely and won the 2011 ISSTD Award for the year's best written work on trauma. As a lead investigator on several multi-site programs to treat interpersonal trauma, Dr. Muller has lectured internationally, Australia, UK, Europe, USA, and has been keynote speaker at mental health conferences in New Zealand and Canada. He founded an online magazine, the Trauma and Mental Health Report, that is now visited by over 100,000 readers a year. With over 25 years in the field, he practices in Toronto. So welcome. Welcome.
Hello, hello, hello. Thanks so much. I'm really glad to be here. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, you know, I have just spent the last month or so reading your new book, and I was telling you before we started recording how I love the way that you have woven together your own personal story and your family history and the work that you do with clients, and you have such a lovely way of being with someone's story and being with your own story and understanding your own journey and how that impacts the people that you are sitting with.
Thank you. Oh, that's really nice to hear. I mean, it was important to me to bring in aspects of my own story, particularly because I think everybody has been through something that they can connect to around this issue of trauma, and I wanted to be honest and transparent about what brought me into the field and what made me interested in it. So, so it was important to me to try to connect it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it weaves together this incredible story because it's not about someone over there. This is about all of our stories in one way or another.
That's definitely trying to do. Thank you. Yeah. And I do talk in the book, and maybe we'll get to it at some point in the interview, but I'd be happy to talk about it, kind of what did bring me into the field.
Yeah, and that's where I would love to start is, yeah, okay, trauma is a big field, and it's, you know, for some people it's like, oh gosh, trauma, you know, we're going to talk about the bad things, we're going to talk about the scary things that happened. Right. What got you interested in trauma?
Oh, okay, all right, if we can have, I'm happy to start with that. So when I started in the field, I didn't realize that the thing that brought me in was the thing that brought me in. So yeah. In other words, I got into it because I was thinking, you know, it's this really interesting research, and I had a really interesting professor who kind of inspired me. And that's what I thought, and that's what I would have said if you would have asked me, you know, what got me into the field, if you would have asked me that question 15 years ago. But somewhere in my early 40s, so I was already doing this work, I realized that what I thought got me into it wasn't really what got me into it. And I started to have more conversations with my parents about their past. And I started to have more conversations with them in particular about the Holocaust. And I realized at some point that what got me into the field really was their history, and the history then that I, through my taking in their history and connecting to it, have then been part of. And so specifically, my parents, as I talk a little bit about in the book, My parents were children during the Holocaust, and my mom was about 6 or 7. My dad was about 10. My dad's father was killed. My mother's parents were not killed, but they both experienced many months of being very, very frightened. My mom was hidden, separated from her parents, and it made sense to do that because they wanted to hedge their bets that the children would be, by separating them and having them be with Christian families, it would be more likely that they would survive. That was my mom's parents' strategy. And for my dad, his father was taken away and he was abandoned, essentially, then taken into the care of his uncle. But anyway, essentially, it was because of Christian relatives that my parents survived. So I'm Jewish, my parents are Jewish. And they were very close to getting killed at several points in their childhoods.
Wow.
After the war, my father, having lost his father because of the Holocaust, he then had to go and had to start working, and he had to become the man of the house. Now, he was only 10 years old. And so
Wow.
he went, started working, making money because there wasn't enough money. And so between my father's mother and my father's salary, so I think my father was 13 or 14 when he started actually working as an upholsterer. That's how they survived financially in Soviet Hungary. So after the war, obviously, Hungary then became Soviet, communist, and so essentially it was Soviet occupied. So that my parents essentially, I talk about this in the book, I think to a large extent lost their childhoods to experiences that I would consider to be very traumatic, cultural trauma, cultural and not family genocide, but cultural genocide. Both my parents experienced that. And I grew up with lots of stories about the Holocaust. Many people in my family did not have stories about the Holocaust because their parents didn't want to talk about it. And so this idea of how do people deal with their story of loss, cultural loss, family loss? Do some families talk about their stories, and do some families hide their stories, sweep it under the rug as a way of coping? Those issues were really relevant in my life ever since I was a kid, but I didn't realize it until about 15 years ago that those stories had such an impact on me. So that's really kind of what brought me into the field of loss, trauma, dealing with people's losses, and finding a way to talk about it.
Right, and I think that that's so important, and that's a theme that I saw throughout your book is we have to talk about these things, that there's so many things, and I see that in the people that I work with, that there are so many things that are difficult to talk about, that in our families we don't talk about, these stories that then take on a life of their own, and we don't really understand the impact of not talking about it.
Exactly. Now, for many people, it's very hard to talk about it, so it's understandable. And I certainly wouldn't want anyone to feel blamed if they have that difficulty. I think people don't talk about these traumatic events because it's a way of coping. Because if they had a language for it, if they had a way of dealing with it, very often they would. But they often engage in these coping strategies to try to avoid it because it's so scary, and so it's their way of dealing with it. But yeah, what we find from research is that if you can help people find a way to connect to their stories, that their families do better. And research on family storytelling shows that in families where they actually can tell stories about their past, and parents are able to talk to their kids about tough stuff that happened to them, even if it's not a traumatic event, but tough stuff that they've been through, that their kids find it so much easier to then talk to their parents. And so it becomes this, like, there's a kind of vulnerability that the parents demonstrate that then kids feel opens the door for many of them. And so family storytelling can be a very good vehicle to be able to form family connections. And there's a lot of good research about this. I forget the name of the researcher that I cite in the book, but there have been a few studies that have looked at family storytelling and how helpful it is to families to be able to cope with difficult events, losses and developmental transitions and things like that.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit, because you're touching on, again, the idea of trauma, and that there are sometimes really big events which we can often all agree, oh, this was traumatic, this was a loss, this was really difficult. And then there are these other things that happen too, and we're talking about all of them. So
Exactly.
can you expand a little bit on that idea of traumas, or just things that are really difficult even, and that we might get stuck in somewhere?
For sure, yeah. And so in the field, there's a lot of discussion about what's, defining what's post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, what's trauma, and what's extreme stress. And a little bit of these debates are kind of arguing about how many angels there are in a pin can dance on a pin of a head, head of a pin. In other words, some of it is just language, but I think when we talk about trauma, we talk about a response to an extreme life situation, and people respond to extreme life events in different ways. Some people respond by being able to deal with it, by being able to manage through those situations, and they're not permanently affected. Other people are permanently affected. And it's not that some people are better than others, but we all have different vulnerabilities. Some of these vulnerabilities are genetic. Some of these vulnerabilities are strengths that our families bring us. So people who have lower self-esteem, people who have had families where there's been a lot of mental illness, they have a lot more difficulty coping with extremely stressful events. Others who have had more resources, who have been privileged enough to have families where parents have been able to talk with them, or where they have better opportunity for good self-esteem because of good positive messages that they've had from childhood onwards. Those individuals have a greater likelihood of being a little bit more resilient, and even in the face of extreme stress, are less likely to develop full-blown PTSD. And so different people respond to extreme stress in different ways. And again, whether we talk about something being a traumatic or not, those responses different in life events. And what's important is for you to take
really quick.
Okay.
So what's important?
What's important is to take an inventory of what your response is, your personal response is to the extremely stressful and difficult life events that you've been through, and to try to be honest with yourself, and to find people to talk about those events with.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit, because I think many times when someone brings up this idea that there's something difficult that happened, that there was a trauma, we discount the distressing things, or something that may be distressing to us.
Right.
And it doesn't matter whether it was the Holocaust, or whether it was the way that your dad looked at you when you didn't do something you were supposed to do. It can create this distress in you.
So different people respond to highly stressful events in very different ways. And what's important is that we recognize that when people work with trauma survivors, or when people have had loved ones who've had traumatic events, that they recognize that to a large extent it's subjective. If people have experienced overwhelming life events, and they themselves have an extreme reaction to it, we don't want to judge people on that basis. In the book, I talk about, and I'm not sure if this is what you're alluding to, Rebecca, but in the book, I talk about a case of somebody whose dog passed away. And I talk in the book a little bit about how I sort of struggled as a therapist with how to react to this person initially, because this person had this much more extreme traumatic event where their father had killed himself. Now, I don't want to minimize the extremity of someone's father dying by suicide. It's an extremely serious event. But when this person came in to see me for therapy, that's not where they were at. That's not what was on their mind. And I kept wanting to turn it back to sort of connecting to the loss of their father. What I really had to do initially, like we eventually did get to in therapy, we got to the issue of the loss of their father, and that was fine, and we did good work. But what I really had to do as a therapist was I had to meet them where they were at, which is that they were grieving the loss of their beloved pet. And their pet, they were having nightmares about the loss of their pet. They felt guilty about the loss of their pet. Their dog, they loved their dog. They felt that their dog loved them in a way that nobody else could. Nobody else gave them unconditional love the way their dog did. And until I was really able to sit with that and connect with them around that, I wasn't able to do good work with them. So that's an important lesson for me, is to take the person's suffering seriously, that when people go through what they subjectively experience as a traumatic event, we have to take their suffering seriously, not prejudge it and say, well, this doesn't count because it wasn't sexual abuse or it wasn't physical abuse or something else that we've put into the box of abuse or trauma. We have to understand that people's traumatic events can vary depending on their own subjective reactions.
And I think about how many people I work with who judge themselves right there. You know, just as that story unfolded, as you described it in the book, there was the woman was judging herself because, well, wait, why am I having such a hard time with this? Everyone around me thinks I should be over it. You know,
Exactly.
and so there is this place where we judge ourselves for, well, I should be over this. Why am I still struggling with this? You know, after the birth of my first child, I had pieces of my birth that I kept going back to, and they weren't even things that actually happened. They were things that could have happened just in the circumstances. And I struggled with them. I was in so much distress, and I kept saying, why am I struggling with this? Why can't I just, it's over. Why can't I just move on? And it wasn't until I could accept that this is where I was, that this is what was coming up for me, and be with it, that I could actually move through it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's such an important point, is that people will judge themselves. People will engage in this kind of self-blame. They'll do self-invalidation. So we talk about how validating people's trauma is important in therapy.
Yeah.
But what if the person invalidates themselves and they say, you know, I don't deserve help, or like, I was a wimp, you know, I shouldn't be whining about what happened to me, or, you know, that sort of thing. Yeah, people will really blame themselves. They will, they'll sort of act as if they should be over it by now. And people get over these things at different rates, and we can't tell people you should, you know. I had a client whose son, a different client whose son died by suicide, and after 6 months, people were telling her, well, listen, it was a long time ago. And I said to her, your son was 22. You adored him. You had a good relationship with him. 6 months is a drop in the bucket. Like, I mean, you know, when someone loses a child, I mean, we can't say what's the right amount of time, what's the wrong amount of time for someone to sort of, quote, deal with their loss. It varies from person to person. And I really like the example you gave about how women respond in a postpartum way to you know, the birth of a child. Now, obviously I'm a male, but I can say that my wife, you know, I can sort of say by standing on the sidelines of what she experienced and conversations she and I have had together after the birth of our kids. So we have identical twin boys. And it was a high-risk pregnancy.
Yeah.
And so she had all these ideas. She's a psychiatrist. She had all these ideas about exactly how the birth was going to go. And she struggled afterwards with a lot of self-blame. And she talked about with me this idea that she felt that there was this, kind of female macho idea that if you're the right kind of woman, again, I'm speaking as a man, so I'm not trying to speak for women. I'll just say that this was how she sort of conveyed this to me, and how I sort of understood what she was telling me, that this idea that many women feel that I'm supposed to give birth in exactly the right kind of way, and this is how, and I imagine that this is how it's going to go, and that they blame themselves very often if it doesn't go exactly that way. Exactly what you said, Rebecca, and I think that that's something that I was really interested in hearing her tell me about and learning about from her. That wow, I didn't realize that there was this kind of if you're the quote right kind of woman, this is what you're gonna do. You're not gonna whatever. You're gonna have these ideas about exactly how it's gonna go. It was very interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, there can be a lot of self-blame around traumatic events, and that I think that fits very nicely with what you were saying.
I'm Rebecca Thompson Hitt, and this is the All Relationships Can Heal podcast. I've been talking with Dr. Robert T. Muller, author of Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up. We'll be back again tomorrow to continue our conversation about parenting and trauma and how that can show up in our parenting relationships. See you tomorrow.